75 to 80%. That's the proportion of divorced adults who, 5 years after their divorce, rate their overall life satisfaction as equal to or higher than it was during the marriage. Not a slim majority, not half, three-quarters or more. That comes from Mavis Hetherington's Virginia Longitudinal Study of Divorce. 30 years of data, 1,400 families tracked from separation through rebuilding. You know the narrative. Guy gets divorced, goes a little crazy. New wardrobe, spontaneous trip to Portugal, dates 3 people in a month, buys a motorcycle he doesn't need, and the culture immediately labels it midlife crisis, reckless avoidance. But what if the data tells a completely different story? Tedeschi and Calhoun, the psychologists who literally coined the term post-traumatic growth, found that 60 to 70% of divorced individuals report at least one major domain of growth within 5 years. New possibilities, greater personal strength, a deeper appreciation of life. Divorce ranks alongside bereavement and serious illness as one of the most reliable triggers of post-traumatic growth in the research literature, not despite the pain through it. Let's map the territory. Hetherington's longitudinal data identified 3 distinct phases that divorced adults move through. Phase 1, crisis, 0 to 2 years. Everything is destabilized. Identity, routines, social networks, finances. Phase 2, transition, years 2 through 3. This is where the experimentation happens. New behaviors, new relationships, new versions of yourself get tried on and discarded. Phase 3, new equilibrium, years 3 to 5. A stable identity reemerges, not the old one, a new one. And here's the part that matters. The wild phase isn't a detour from recovery. It maps directly onto the transition phase. It is the transition phase. The experimentation, the risk-taking, the trying things you never would have tried. That's the mechanism by which a new identity gets constructed. The U-curve of life satisfaction dips hardest in the first 18 months, then begins climbing during exactly the period when the so-called wild behavior peaks. Bavino and Sharkin published a study in the Journal of Divorce and Remarriage showing that individuals who actively engaged in redefining their identity, not passively waiting for things to normalize, but deliberately experimenting with who they are, reported up to 50% higher levels of personal growth compared to those who just waited it out. The wild phase, when it works, isn't chaos. It's accelerated identity experimentation. This is the objection, and it's a fair one because sometimes it's exactly right. The difference isn't in the behavior, it's in the motivation behind the behavior, and the research draws a very clear line. Sparra and Emery's work at the University of Virginia, published in Psychological Science, distinguished between what they called autonomous exploration and compensatory exploration. Autonomous exploration is self-directed. You try new things because you're genuinely curious about who you are outside the marriage. You travel because you want to see something, not because you can't sit still. You date because you're interested, not because you're terrified of being alone. Compensatory exploration is the opposite. It's numbing. It's using novelty and stimulation to avoid processing the loss. Same behaviors on the surface, radically different outcomes underneath. The autonomous group, 68% showed markers of post-traumatic growth at the 2-year follow-up. The compensatory group, 24%, same wild phase, same external behaviors. Nearly 3 times the difference in outcomes based entirely on the internal orientation. Let's talk about the specific domains where men go wild because the data breaks them down. First, sex. Approximately 30 to 40% of divorced individuals report a significant increase in sexual activity or exploration in the first 2 to 3 years post-divorce. About 10 to 15% of that group engages in what researchers classify as higher risk sexual behavior. But here's what the moralizers miss. The outcomes don't track the frequency of the behavior. They track the motivation. A man who explores dating because he's discovering what he actually wants in a partner, that's autonomous. A man who's sleeping with someone new every week because silence in his apartment makes him panic, that's compensatory. The behavior looks identical from the outside. Second domain, money and career. About 20 to 25% of divorced individuals report elevated financial risk-taking, impulsive investments, speculative career changes, and roughly 31% engage in what researchers call lifestyle inflation, spending significantly more on experiences, appearance, or living situation than their pre-divorce baseline. Again, the data doesn't say this is inherently destructive. It says the outcome depends on whether the spending is building something or filling something. And here's the number that puts it all in perspective. Only 5 to 10% of divorced adults fall into patterns, substance abuse, chronic depression, compulsive behavior, that persist beyond the transition phase and become genuinely maladaptive. That's Hetherington's data across 3 decades. 90% or more move through the wild phase and come out the other side. The wild phase has a built-in expiration date for the vast majority of people. It's a stage, not a destination. So this is the question that actually matters. Not should you go wild. The data says most people will, and most people will be fine. The question is, how do you tell in real time whether your version of wild is the kind that builds a new identity or the kind that delays building one? Tedeschi and Calhoun's updated framework from 2004 identified 5 specific domains of post-traumatic growth: new possibilities relating to others, personal strength, spiritual change, and appreciation of life. The men who come through the wild phase stronger aren't hitting all 5. They're hitting at least one, deliberately. They're not just accumulating experiences, they're integrating them. And when you look at which domains divorced men score highest in, it's new possibilities, 32% of the growth variance, and personal strength, 28%. Not spiritual awakening, not suddenly appreciating sunsets. They're discovering they can do things they didn't know they could do, and they're realizing they're tougher than the marriage led them to believe. That's what the wild phase is for. Here's the timeline data that nobody talks about. Hetherington's research found that the median duration of the transition phase, the wild phase, is approximately 2.5 years, not 6 months, not forever, 2.5 years. And the men who tried to skip it, who forced themselves into stability and routine immediately after the crisis phase, actually showed slower identity reconstruction and lower life satisfaction at the 5-year mark than the men who allowed themselves the experimentation period. But, and this is the critical caveat, the men who extended the transition phase beyond 4 years showed the worst outcomes of all 3 groups. 43% life satisfaction versus 71% for the natural transition group. The wild phase works when it has boundaries. When it becomes a permanent lifestyle, it stops being exploration and starts being avoidance with better branding. There's an optimal window, roughly 2 to 3.5 years, long enough to genuinely experiment, short enough that the experimentation is still in service of building something. After 3.5 years, the returns diminish sharply. The novelty stops producing insight and starts producing just more novelty. So let's build this into something you can actually use. 5 questions. The Exploration Audit, not a judgment, a diagnostic. Based on the combined research from Tedeschi and Calhoun's growth framework, Spara and Emery's motivation distinction, and Hetherington's transition phase data. Question 1. Am I building skills, relationships, or self-knowledge, or am I just collecting stimulation? Autonomous exploration produces something you can name. Compensatory exploration produces a blur. Question 2, do I feel more like myself than I did 6 months ago? Growth has a direction. If the answer is I don't know, that's data. Question 3, can I articulate what I'm learning about myself? This is the integration test. Experiences without reflection are just events. Question 4, am I choosing this or defaulting to it? Autonomous exploration feels like agency. Compensatory exploration feels like momentum you can't stop. Question 5, would I be okay stopping tomorrow? If the thought of a quiet weekend triggers anxiety, that's not exploration. That's dependency on stimulation. 4 or 5 yeses, you're in the autonomous zone. The data says you're likely on the trajectory toward post-traumatic growth. Keep going, but keep auditing. 2 or 3, you're in mixed territory. Some of what you're doing is building, some is buffering. Time to get honest about which is which. 0 or 1. You've crossed from exploration into avoidance. The wild phase has stopped serving you. That doesn't mean you failed. It means the tool has outlived its usefulness. Here's where I want to land, because the culture gives you exactly 2 narratives about going wild after divorce. Narrative 1, you're broken and self-destructing. Narrative 2, you're living your best life and anyone who questions it is just jealous. The data supports neither. What the data actually says is this: the wild phase is a psychologically predictable, well-documented stage of post-divorce adjustment. Most men go through some version of it. Most men come out the other side stronger. The variable that determines whether it helps or hurts isn't the behavior. It's the orientation behind the behavior, towards something or away from something, building or escaping. 90% or more move through it. You probably will too. The audit isn't there to stop you. It's there to make sure the phase is still working for you, and to tell you when it's time to let it become something else. The full exploration audit, with the scoring rubric, the autonomous versus compensatory self-assessment, and every study cited in this episode, is in the newsletter. Link in the description. First issue is free. If this reframed how you think about the post-divorce wild phase, subscribe. Every Thursday we take the questions men are actually asking and run them through the research. No opinions, no moralizing, just data. Next, the loneliness tax. What social isolation actually costs divorced men, in dollars, in health outcomes, and in years. The numbers are worse than you think, and the fix is simpler than you'd expect.